The day after Freedom Day, and we're going to have this conversation now with retired Judge President of the Competition Appeals Court, Judge Dennis Davis, joins us via our video link this morning to talk about a whole range of things the day after Freedom Day. It is also Freedom Month, Judge. It's great to have you with us here on the program. And I suppose, you know, among the issues we want to sort of ventilate with you this day after Freedom Day, and I think it's something that many South Africans probably grapple with every day, but perhaps more starkly on Freedom Day and in Freedom Month. This lack of trust in the arms of government, and we know that the judiciary is one of the arms of government. You know, where do you stand, Judge Davis, as we sort of have these conversations 29 years into democracy?
Well, I think, you know, people like myself kind of go back and think when we stood in those queues. And, of course, it wasn't just 27th. You may recall that I think the election went on for a couple of days. Stood in the queues on 27th, and today would have stood with an extraordinary amount of hope that we were going to be on a journey which was going to basically bury our apartheid past once and for all. Of course, it was optimistic to believe this could be done in a year or two. But I think we have to be fair. It's 29 years later. And there are absolutely extraordinary gaps between the promises of the Constitution and the day-to-day lives that most South Africans live. So if you take, for example, we have a series of socio-economic rights of housing, of water, of education, medical care, etc. For the vast majority of South Africans, they remain absent rather than the present. Then, of course, all of a sudden, because there's been such a failure right across the board. I mean, the president speaks about it, and he's right to. But the question is, whose fault is it that, in fact, delivery has not taken place? And the tragedy of it all is that some people then turn against the Constitution and say it's the Constitution's fault. Well, constitutions don't deliver on their own. It requires government to do so.
Yeah, I think you and I have had that exact conversation, in fact, the failings around the Constitution, but actually it's not responsible for implementation. And yeah, I do remember the queues in 1994. I was queuing with my grandmother in Bonteheuwel, and we queued for the better part of that day, waiting for her chance to go and cast her vote on what was such an emotional day. And one can just, I mean, I didn't vote on that day, but I certainly had a sense of what a watershed moment it was for our country, just given how high emotions were on the day and how much hope there was.
Yeah, well, just to make one other point about that, Michelle, what is interesting to me was on that day, you know, for the first time, as he stood in the queues, and people, notwithstanding race, gender, class, sort of were helping each other, you know, because it was a hot day, and sharing water and food. There was a sense for the first time in the history of South Africa that there was a possibility of carving out a new South African identity, which would be one which would have transcended all of those divisions. I knew it wasn't going to happen in a day, but I find it rather sad that we've seemed to move further away from that rather than, in fact, together. There are, of course, always reminiscences and parts of a new South African identity, but it happens all too rarely. And it's partly because if you look at the distribution of resources, the color of your skin to a large degree determines the allocation of resources that you'll receive. And that, of course, was the apartheid system. And it's tragic that we've not been able to actually do far more to close that gap.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you say, Judge Davis, the color of your skin, it largely determines the kind of resources you have access to. What do you say about, you know, because resources, many people will say it also determines the kind of access you have to justice, the kind of lawyers you're able to employ when the need arises. You know, what's the role here of the judiciary, of everyone is equal before the law? Because that certainly is not the case, because it's linked to resources, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, there are two questions, there are a series of questions asked. On the first place, I mean, I think the judiciary, to a large degree, has done pretty well over the 29 years. In fact, it's been the best judiciary South Africa's ever had since its inception, you know, hundreds of years ago, when it was a colony. But it is also true that justice is not done on an equal basis. partly it is because of resources. And I mean, just take the quite absurd situation, what we call the Stalingrad approach. So that there's some people who can basically employ the law to subvert the law, and yet, as I used to be struck by, as a practicing judge, some poor person would steal 5 avocado pears and 3 bananas at a supermarket and land up by being charged and convicted in a magistrate's court without any representation. But if on the other hand you're alleged to have stolen all sorts of millions, you arrive with hundreds of lawyers and you basically ensure that the case never ever gets heard. And the fact that we don't have a system that people get equal representation, or at least adequate representation, is itself a terribly damning aspect. And then, of course, the other point about it is that all too often, if you look who's in our courts, it also has a sort of racial character, which is particularly problematic.
We are starting to sound like a stuck record if we listen to what the President had to say in his Freedom Day address. And ironically, it was in Klerksdorp yesterday, an area in the northwest that's facing all kinds of service delivery challenges, Judge Davis. Where to from here? We've got our national elections next year. One does feel that sometimes the judiciary is being used as a scapegoat, plenty of arguments being made about how there's biasness in the judiciary, that, the judiciary is fighting political battles as well. A sure sign that those who are responsible for the state of affairs we're in South Africa is now trying to find any way out, any other explanation other than I am to blame.
Well, let's just take 2 points from what you've made. Firstly, the time for policy statements, the time for crisis committees, the time for commissions of inquiry, long gone. You come along and you say, these are our problems, well, get it done. And I think there's an increasing level of anger in the society, which can go one of 2 ways. It can either implode into a form of authoritarian populism, which we've seen in other countries, which to a large degree, you think, for example, of Hungary or Poland or, for example, Trump's America. We could go that way and therefore basically subvert that glorious enterprise that we began 29 years ago, or we could use that anger to hold the government accountable to ensure that actually we don't just get policies and speeches, we actually get implementation. That's the first issue. The second that you raise, yes, the judiciary has been used for lawfare, as it were, because in the absence of, as it were, a politics that works adequately for all. I'm not talking about party politics. I'm talking about the system of politics. It means that almost all political disputes they end up in the courts, and they shouldn't necessarily. And once that happens, the judiciary is in the firing line, because ultimately political disputes which are not best resolved through law are having to be resolved that way, and they result in a sort of controversy, which itself makes it very problematic for the legitimacy of the judiciary going forward.
More talk, less action is what we're seeing, and we want it the other way around, right? Less talk, less committees, no inquiries.
Well, people have an opportunity. People have an opportunity, not for me as a judge, to enter the frame of party politics, but it is for an active citizenry. That's critical. An active citizenry to demand more. And I think sometimes we have been, but on other occasions we've been extraordinarily passive. Yeah,
it's an active citizenry, Judge. And many will argue that were it not for the work of investigative journalists in our country as well, there would be so much that would have been left still covered under a shroud of secrecy.
It's a sort of implicit rebuke to me, and you're right, because I've been banging on about all sorts of other things, but not the media. And I'm not suggesting all the media. Some of the media has hardly covered itself in glory. All too often I listen to interviews which are, as it were, so uncritical and essentially reproduce one particular narrative at the expense of another. But it's absolutely correct that there have been significant segments of the media which have been absolutely crucial to exposing corruption, to holding government accountable, and to giving the public at least a framework within which they can protest, can argue, and can in fact make decisions which are ones which are informed. In that sense, the media have been absolutely crucial in the last 29 years.
Make decisions perhaps including where to put your X when we go to our 7th national election next year.
Well, the national elections are going to be... what's going to be interesting to me is the extent to which that act of citizenry is going to play out over the next 12, 14, 15 months in those national elections. And I think we must be under no illusions about it, one way or another. If, for example, as people are, they're angry, they're dissatisfied, one would hope that that anger and that passion would actually be directed to ensuring that the political process begins to work for them, rather than in fact being subverted. So what we do is throw away the Constitution, rather than in fact developing a governance that works for 60 million people.
Judge Dennis Davis, it's always a pleasure talking to you this day after Freedom Day. Thank you so much for joining us. Judge Davis is a retired judge president of the Competition Appeals Court, as we continue to unpack a whole range of issues related to, as I say, Freedom Day yesterday and what is Freedom Month, which is coming to an end this weekend.